The morning of June 19th, 1944, 355 miles west of Saipan, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship Taiho, the most modern carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy's first mobile fleet. Through his binoculars, he scanned the eastern horizon where American Task Force 58 waited. His intelligence officers had confirmed the position. 15 American carriers, against his 9. The mathematics favored him, or so he believed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ozawa's pilots would launch from beyond the range of American counterstrikes. His aircraft, particularly the legendary Zero fighters, possessed superior range. They would strike the American carriers, land on Guam's airfields to rearm and refuel, then strike again on their return flight. The Americans, locked in place defending the Saipan invasion force, couldn't pursue. His land-based aircraft from Guam would coordinate the attack, nearly 1,000 aircraft against whatever the Americans could muster. What Ozawa didn't know, couldn't have known, was that 6 of those 15 American carriers belonged to a new class of warship that would rewrite every assumption about carrier warfare. The Essex-Class, ships designed around a single revolutionary principle: launch overwhelming numbers of aircraft faster than any carrier force in history. Within hours, that principle would collide with Ozawa's careful calculations. The result would earn a nickname from American pilots who couldn't quite believe what they were witnessing: the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. But to understand how the Essex-Class shattered Japanese naval aviation in a single afternoon, we must first understand the world these ships were designed to dominate. In March 1944, as American shipyards delivered their 17th Essex-Class carrier in less than 2 years, Japanese commanders faced a crisis they refused to acknowledge publicly. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war with the world's most experienced carrier aviators. Men who had spent years perfecting the art of deck operations, navigation, and combat flying. At Pearl Harbor, at Ceylon, across the South Pacific, these pilots had demonstrated capabilities that stunned their opponents. By mid-1944, most of them were dead. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had killed or wounded 110 carrier aircrewmen, roughly 25% of the embarked crews. But the real devastation went deeper. The loss of flight deck crews, mechanics, armourers, and the organisational knowledge they embodied proved irreplaceable. Japan began the Pacific War with 2,000 carrier-qualified aircrewmen, a seemingly inexhaustible reserve. But carrier qualification requires years of training. Years Japan didn't have. The pilots climbing into cockpits aboard Ozawa's carriers in June 1944 averaged less than 6 months of flight training. Some had fewer than 100 hours in their aircraft. They could take off and land. Barely. The complex choreography of coordinated strikes, the split-second timing required for deck operations, the ability to navigate hundreds of miles over open ocean and find a moving carrier, these skills required time the Japanese training program no longer provided. Admiral Ozawa knew this. His after-action reports from previous engagements documented the problem with clinical precision. But he also knew something else. American carriers operated under constraints his force didn't share. The Americans had to defend the Saipan beachhead. They couldn't abandon the Marines fighting ashore. His fleet could choose the range of engagement. His aircraft had longer range. He would strike from 300 miles out, beyond American retaliation. What he didn't know was how fundamentally the Essex-Class had changed the equation. The Essex-Class program began in July 1940, 4 months before Pearl Harbor, when the U.S. Navy ordered the first ships of what would become the largest aircraft carrier construction program in history. The design team faced a liberating reality. For the first time since World War I, naval treaty limitations had collapsed. Japan and Italy had withdrawn from treaty obligations. The United States was free to build carriers to whatever specifications the mission required. The mission requirement was simple to state, revolutionary to achieve: launch more aircraft, faster, than any carrier force on Earth. Every previous carrier design had accepted compromises: limited hangar space, cramped flight decks, elevators positioned to minimize structural complexity rather than maximize operational tempo. The Essex design rejected every compromise. At 872 feet long with a displacement of 27,500 tons, Essex-class carriers were 60 feet longer and 10 feet wider than their Yorktown-class predecessors, more than a third heavier. But size alone didn't explain their revolutionary capability. The Essex-class embodied a design philosophy that prioritized offensive striking power above all else. The single most important design criterion, documented in the original specifications, was the ability to launch a large deck-load strike. 4 full squadrons of modern aircraft spotted on the flight deck for a single launch, while a reserve squadron warmed up engines on the hangar deck below. To achieve this, naval architects made choices that would prove decisive. The deck-edge elevator, pioneered on USS Wasp and perfected on the Essex-class, moved aircraft between hangar and flight deck without disrupting operations. Unlike centerline elevators that blocked deck space when in use, the deck-edge elevator hung off the side of the ship. If damaged, it didn't render the flight deck unusable. More importantly, aircraft could be moved to the flight deck while other planes were landing. Continuous operations. The flight deck itself stretched longer and wider than any previous American carrier. But what happened beneath that deck mattered more. Squadron-ready rooms and the Combat Information Center occupied the gallery deck, immediately below the flight deck. This placement made these spaces vulnerable to damage. It also minimized the width of the island superstructure, creating more usable deck space. Every foot of flight deck translated to more aircraft spotted for launch. The hangar deck design broke from both American and British practice. Unarmored, open. Critics called it a vulnerability. Designers called it operational necessity. An unarmored hangar meant more vertical clearance, room for a larger, more diverse air group. More critically, the open hangar allowed aircraft to warm up their engines below deck, while the flight deck conducted simultaneous operations. When those aircraft reached the flight deck via the deck-edge elevator, they were ready for immediate launch. The numbers told the story. Japanese carriers in 1941 required 40 minutes to spot aircraft on deck, then another 20 minutes for engine warm-up. 60 minutes total. Essex-class carriers, through careful orchestration of hangar and flight deck operations, could cut that time nearly in half. And they could spot more aircraft to begin with. The fuel storage system embodied the same aggressive design philosophy. Essex-class carriers carried 240,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, enough to support sustained operations far from port. The fuel system itself incorporated innovations that reduced fire risk. Fuel lines used seawater displacement rather than pumps. As aviation fuel was drawn off, seawater entered the bottom of the tanks, forcing the fuel up without creating dangerous vapor spaces. In case of fire, the entire fuel system on the hangar and flight decks could be rapidly drained. These weren't incremental improvements. They represented a fundamental reconceptualization of carrier warfare. Previous carrier designs viewed the ship as a mobile airfield that needed protection. The Essex-class viewed the ship as a delivery system. The aircraft themselves provided protection through overwhelming offensive power. American naval architects designed the Essex-class to generate what they called sortie rate, the number of aircraft launched per unit time. In the cold mathematics of carrier warfare, sortie rate translated directly to combat power. More aircraft in the air meant more bombs delivered, more fighters providing combat air patrol, more reconnaissance aircraft extending search range. The Essex-class was built to maintain higher sortie rates for longer periods than any carrier before it. But could the ships deliver on that promise under combat conditions? In June 1944, Vice Admiral Ozawa was about to find out. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58 from the bridge of USS Lexington, call sign Blue Ghost. At 57 years old, Mitcher represented a generation of naval aviators who had pioneered carrier operations when the concept was still experimental. He had commanded USS Hornet during the Doolittle raid. He understood carrier warfare not as theory but as lived experience. On the morning of June 19th, His force represented the most powerful concentration of naval aviation in human history. 15 carriers organized into 4 task groups, 7 Essex-Class fleet carriers, the veteran USS Enterprise, 8 Independence-class light carriers, supporting them 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The carriers alone embarked 891 aircraft, but numbers told only part of the story. The composition of those aircraft revealed how completely American naval aviation had evolved since Pearl Harbor. The F-6F Hellcat had replaced the inadequate F-4F Wildcat as the Navy's primary fighter. At 375 miles per hour, maximum speed, the Hellcat could outrun, outclimb, and outdive the Zero. More importantly, it could absorb punishment. Armor plating protected the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires. A Zero pilot who got a solid burst into a Hellcat often watched in frustration as the American plane continued flying. A Hellcat pilot who hit a Zero watched it disintegrate. The SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber represented the latest evolution in precision strike aircraft. It could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs internally, another 1,000 pounds underwing. The TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, though designed for ship-killing torpedoes, had proven remarkably adaptable. With radar equipment, Avengers conducted long-range search missions. They hunted submarines. They dropped bombs, mines, and depth charges. 3 crew members, redundant systems, and robust construction made them difficult to shoot down. Each Essex-class carrier embarked approximately 90 aircraft organized into air groups, 2 fighter squadrons of 18 aircraft each, 2 dive bomber squadrons, also 18 planes each, 1 torpedo squadron of 18 Avengers. The air group commander often flew an additional fighter. The composition could flex based on mission requirements, but the total remained around 90 operational aircraft. The magic happened in how these aircraft were deployed. Traditional carrier doctrine, developed by both American and Japanese navies before the war, assumed sequential operations. Spot aircraft on deck, launch them. Wait for the deck to clear, spot the next group, launch them. Recovery operations required the deck to be completely clear of parked aircraft. The arrested landing system demanded clear space aft of the landing area. One malfunction, one aircraft that couldn't be moved quickly, and the entire operation stopped. Essex-class carriers, through careful choreography, exploiting their deck-edge elevators and expanded flight deck, could maintain nearly continuous operations. A typical strike launch began in the hangar deck. Air crews had been briefed hours earlier. They knew their assigned aircraft, their position in the strike formation, their navigation waypoints, their target, and their return route. While pilots attended briefings, aviation mechanics completed pre-flight checks on every aircraft in the strike package. The dance began when the air officer, working from primary flight control high in the island structure, ordered the first squadron to the flight deck. The forward deck edge elevator lifted 18 fighters from the hangar. While they were being positioned on the flight deck, engines cold, the after elevator brought up 18 dive bombers. Flight deck crews, wearing color-coded jerseys identifying their specialties, manhandled each aircraft into position. Yellow shirts, the aircraft handlers, pushed and pulled aircraft with practiced coordination. Despite the Hellcat's folding wings, each plane still required precise placement, 30 feet between aircraft, tight enough to maximize the number spotted, far enough apart to allow safe engine start and taxi. While the first 36 aircraft were being spotted on the flight deck, the third squadron, 18 torpedo bombers, remained in the hangar with engines running. The open hangar design and powerful ventilation systems allowed this. Exhaust fumes vented. The aircraft stayed warm, ready. When the flight deck was fully spotted, the air officer gave the command every pilot waited for. Start engines. 54 aircraft, 36 on the flight deck and 18 in the hangar, began their start sequences within minutes of each other. The sound was overwhelming. 108 radial engines, each producing over 2,000 horsepower, roaring to life. The flight deck trembled. The ship itself seemed to gather energy. The launch, director, standing at the forward end of the flight deck with colored paddles, began the sequence. The first fighter released brakes, rolled forward. The launch director's paddles guided it to the launch position at the bow. The pilot ran up the engine to full power, brakes locked. The launch director checked that the flight deck behind the aircraft was clear. He checked that the pilot was ready. He gave the signal. The pilot released brakes. The Hellcat rolled forward, gaining speed, lifted off as it reached the bow. 15 seconds later, the next fighter launched. 54 aircraft, launched at 15 to 20-second intervals, departed the flight deck in under 20 minutes. Before the last fighter cleared the deck, the after elevator was already bringing up the torpedo squadron from the hangar, engines hot, ready to launch immediately. Total time from the order to launch until the last aircraft departed, approximately 30 minutes for 72 aircraft. Recovery operations demonstrated equal sophistication. As strike aircraft returned, the landing signal officer guided each plane to a successful arrested landing. The instant the aircraft caught a wire and stopped, the arresting cable was lowered, the aircraft released. Yellow shirts pushed it forward and to the side. Deck crew immediately reset the arresting gear. 45 seconds later, the next aircraft landed. Aircraft that needed maintenance went down the deck edge elevator to the hangar without crossing the landing area. Aircraft that were ready for another mission were pushed forward to the parking area. The continuous flow meant that an Essex-Class carrier could recover 70 aircraft in about 45 minutes, then immediately prepare for the next launch. This was the system Vice Admiral Ozawa faced. Not one carrier performing these operations. 15 carriers. 7 of them Essex-Class ships designed from the keel up to maximize sortie rate. But sortie rate alone wouldn't win the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The quality of pilots mattered. The performance of aircraft mattered. Most critically, the coordination between radar-equipped fighter directors and the combat air patrol mattered. American carrier operations in mid-1944 incorporated technology and tactical innovations the Japanese had failed to adopt. Every American carrier carried SK air search radar with effective range exceeding 100 miles. The newer SK-2 radar could detect aircraft formations at 150 miles in good conditions. Surface search radar, the SG model, could detect ships at over 20 miles, even in darkness or poor visibility. More importantly, American carriers had learned how to use radar effectively. The Combat Information Center, located in the gallery deck below the flight deck, became the nerve center of defensive operations. Radar operators tracked incoming raids. Fighter directors, officers specifically trained in radar interpretation and radio communication, controlled the combat air patrol. When an incoming raid appeared on radar, the fighter director calculated intercept courses, directed fighters by radio to the optimal intercept position, provided altitude and bearing information, and talked the pilots onto the target. The system wasn't perfect. Radio discipline sometimes broke down. Pilots occasionally failed to find the targets they were vectored toward, but compared to the Japanese system, which relied primarily on visual spotting, American radar-directed interception represented an overwhelming advantage. The Japanese understood radar. They had developed their own systems, but they had not integrated radar into carrier operations with anything approaching American sophistication. Japanese combat air patrols typically consisted of small 3-plane formations flying at predetermined altitudes for 2-hour shifts. If enemy aircraft appeared within visual range, they attacked. If the enemy didn't appear, they landed when their fuel ran low and were replaced by the next patrol. Against the Essex-Class sortie rate and radar-directed fighter control, this system was obsolete before the first shot was fired. At 8:30 in the morning on June 19th, radar operators aboard American carriers detected the first Japanese raid. 69 aircraft, approaching from the west at Angels 24, military terminology for 24,000 feet altitude. Range, 150 miles, and closing. Fighter directors scrambled every available Hellcat. The combat air patrol already aloft received vectors. Additional fighters launched from every available carrier. The Essex-Class ships demonstrated their design purpose. Within 15 minutes, over 200 Hellcats were either airborne or launching. The Japanese strike package, designated Raid 1 by American fighter directors, consisted of 45 Zero fighters escorting 16 Judy dive bombers and 8 Jill torpedo bombers. The formation held tight, aircraft maintaining close intervals as they approached. Their pilots, many with fewer than 6 months training, flew the standard attack profile they had practiced in training. Maintain formation, follow the leader, rely on superior numbers to overwhelm the defense. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 40 miles from the American fleet, they encountered the first Hellcats. What happened next? American pilots would later describe with a kind of bewildered satisfaction. The Japanese formations, when attacked, failed to execute coordinated defensive maneuvers. Individual Zero pilots broke formation but without apparent coordination. The bombers continued straight ahead, relying on their fighter escort for protection. That escort was disintegrating. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, leading Fighting Squadron 15 from USS Essex, later reported, "It was like shooting ducks in a gallery. They just kept coming straight at us. No evasive action. No tactics. Just straight and level. We shot down 16 before they even saw the fleet." The few Japanese aircraft that penetrated the outer fighter screen encountered a second layer of Hellcats, then a third. By the time the surviving aircraft reached visual range of the American carriers, fewer than 20 remained from the original 69. Ship-based anti-aircraft fire, concentrated fire from 5-inch guns equipped with proximity-fused shells, destroyed most of these. One bomb hit the battleship South Dakota, causing minor damage. One torpedo struck the battleship Indiana, failing to explode. Out of 69 attacking aircraft, only 27 returned to the Japanese carriers. Vice Admiral Ozawa, receiving fragmentary reports from surviving pilots, refused to believe them. His pilots reported hitting multiple American carriers, starting fires, possibly sinking 2 ships. He ordered a second strike launched. Raid 2 departed the Japanese carriers at 9:45 in the morning. 128 aircraft, 53 fighters, 27 dive bombers, 48 torpedo bombers. The largest strike Ozawa's carriers had launched since Pearl Harbor. This attack would overwhelm the American defenses. This attack would vindicate his strategy. American radar detected Raid 2 at 160 miles. Fighter directors scrambled additional Hellcats. The Essex-Class carriers, having recovered the aircraft from the morning's combat air patrol, refueled them, rearmed them, and launched them again within 40 minutes. Fresh pilots, fresh aircraft, the sortie rate that Japanese carriers simply couldn't match. Raid 2 encountered 300 Hellcats. The slaughter intensified. Japanese formations, attacked from multiple directions by American fighters who had developed coordinated tactics through months of combat experience, simply came apart. Zero pilots, trained to rely on their aircraft's superior maneuverability, in one-on-one dogfights, found themselves fighting 4 and 5 Hellcats simultaneously. The Americans used speed and altitude advantage. Dive on the target, make one pass, climb back to altitude. Repeat. The Hellcats' superior dive speed meant Japanese aircraft couldn't follow. The Hellcats' armor meant Japanese fire often failed to score kills even when it hit. 97 of the 128 aircraft in Raid 2 were destroyed. Only 31 returned to the Japanese carriers. Through the afternoon, 2 more Japanese strikes launched. Raid 3, 47 aircraft, lost 7 planes before even reaching the area where they expected to find American carriers. Navigator error, inadequate training, and fuel exhaustion caused many aircraft to turn back or ditch in the ocean. Of the aircraft that continued, 20 were shot down. Raid 4, 82 aircraft, encountered similar devastation. 49 destroyed. By late afternoon on June 19th, Vice Admiral Ozawa had launched 373 aircraft in 4 major strikes. 130 returned to the carriers. Many of those were too damaged to save or suffered landing accidents. By nightfall, Ozawa's 9 carriers had 102 operational aircraft remaining. He had started the day with 430. The Americans lost 23 aircraft in air-to-air combat, 6 more to operational accidents. American pilots, landing back aboard their carriers, struggled to describe what they had witnessed. The enemy aircraft seemed to fly without purpose. Formations broke apart under the first attack. Individual Japanese pilots showed courage, but no tactical sophistication. It was as if the enemy had forgotten everything about fighter combat developed over 3 years of war. They had. The men who knew those hard-won lessons were dead. The pilots flying Ozawa's aircraft were replacements, trained in months rather than years, sent into combat against the most experienced and best-equipped carrier aviation force on Earth. The Battle of the Philippine Sea continued into June 20th, when American carriers launched strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet, sinking 1 more carrier and damaging others. But the battle had been decided on June 19th, the day American pilots called the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. The Essex-Class carriers had launched and recovered aircraft at rates Japanese commanders considered impossible. They had maintained continuous combat air patrol throughout 12 hours of operations. They had generated the sortie rate that turned American numerical advantage into overwhelming combat power. Vice Admiral Ozawa, in his official report, concluded, "The enemy's fighter direction and control surpassed our imagination." He was partially correct. American radar-directed fighter control had been superb, but what truly surpassed imagination was the industrial and operational system that produced 15 carriers, capable of launching nearly 1,000 aircraft, recovering them, rearming them, and launching them again before Japanese carriers could complete a single strike cycle. The Essex-Class hadn't just won a battle. They had revealed a new reality of naval warfare. Victory belonged to the force that could maintain the highest sortie rate with the highest quality aircraft and pilots. In June 1944, no force on Earth could match the American carrier fleet in any of these categories. Japanese commanders had entered the battle, believing their longer-range aircraft and land-based support would compensate for American advantages. They had miscalculated. The Essex-Class carriers, through superior design and operational doctrine, could generate combat power faster than Japanese carriers could respond. The result wasn't merely defeat, it was annihilation. The sun rose on June 21, 1944, over a Pacific Ocean transformed. Vice Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet, limping westward toward safe anchorage, no longer resembled a fighting force. His 9 carriers collectively embarked fewer than 100 operational aircraft. Carriers without aircraft are hollow shells, floating cities with empty streets. The ships remained. The capability to project power had vanished. Ozawa himself would survive the war, commanding the decoy northern force at Leyte Gulf 4 months later, deliberately sacrificing his remaining carriers to lure Admiral Halsey away from the invasion beaches. He understood by then what the Battle of the Philippine Sea had proven. Japanese carrier aviation was finished. Not damaged. Not weakened. Finished. The institutional knowledge, the experienced pilots, the coordinated strike capabilities, all had died in the Philippine Sea. What remained were ships and barely trained aviators who could take off and land but couldn't fight. American intelligence officers, interrogating Japanese commanders after the war, documented Ozawa's assessment with clinical precision. Captain Omae Toshikazu, who served on Ozawa's staff, stated in his October 1945 interrogation, "After the Mariana's operation, it became clear to us that we could no longer hope to defeat the American carrier force in battle. Their production capacity, their pilot training, their operational capabilities, all exceeded what we had believed possible." The numbers supported this conclusion with devastating clarity. Between June 19th and August 15th, 1945, the date of Japanese surrender, the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned 0 new fleet carriers. The Americans commissioned 11 more Essex-Class carriers during the same period. Japan's pilot training program, already inadequate before the Philippine Sea, collapsed entirely. By late 1944, Japanese naval aviators received as little as 3 months of training before assignment to combat units. Many had fewer than 1. 100 hours total flight time. American naval aviators at the same period averaged over 300 hours of training before joining fleet squadrons. But the true cost of Japanese defeat in the Philippine Sea went beyond numbers. It was psychological, strategic, and ultimately fatal to Japan's ability to defend its empire. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had been conceived as the decisive engagement Japanese naval doctrine had long anticipated, the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle that would cripple American naval power and force a negotiated peace. Japanese planners had waited years for the correct moment, the perfect conditions. The American invasion of Saipan had seemed to provide those conditions. American carriers tied to defending the beachhead, Japanese land-based aircraft coordinating with the carrier fleet, longer-range Japanese aircraft dictating engagement distance. Every assumption had proven false. American carriers, far from being tied to defensive positions, had maintained enough flexibility to simultaneously defend Saipan and destroy Japanese strikes. Land-based aircraft from Guam, supposed to provide crucial support, had been annihilated by American carrier strikes before the main battle began. Longer aircraft range meant nothing when American radar detected formations 150 miles out and vectored superior fighters to intercept them. The Essex-Class carriers had been central to this defeat. Not alone. The Hellcats mattered. The radar mattered. The experienced American pilots mattered. But the Essex-Class provided the platform that integrated all these advantages into overwhelming combat power. 7 Essex-Class carriers at Philippine Sea, 6 more joining the fleet by year's end, each capable of launching 70 to 90 aircraft in 30 minutes, each capable of sustained operations day after day, each representing industrial capacity Japan couldn't begin to match. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, sent a message to all commands on June 24, 5 days after the battle. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The bureaucratic language concealed desperate reality. The combined fleet had gambled its remaining carrier strength and lost. No reserve existed. No second chance would come. For the American carriers and their crews, the Battle of the Philippine Sea represented vindication. The Essex-Class design, controversial during development, had proven its worth under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Critics who had questioned the unarmored hangar deck, the emphasis on offensive power over protective armor, the complex deck-edge elevator system, all fell silent. The ships had performed exactly as designed, but USS Franklin, an Essex-Class carrier, would demonstrate in March 1945 that the critics hadn't been entirely wrong. On March 19, 1945, while supporting the invasion of Okinawa, Franklin was struck by 2 500-pound armor-piercing bombs dropped by a single Japanese Judy dive bomber that penetrated thick overcast and attacked before defensive fire could engage. One bomb hit near the centerline aft of the island. The other struck further aft. Both penetrated the wooden flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck among armed and fueled aircraft preparing for launch. The resulting fires and secondary explosions killed 724 men immediately. Another 265 died later from wounds. Franklin became the most heavily damaged carrier to survive the war. She made it back to Pearl Harbor under her own power, a tribute to damage control training and the courage of her crew. But she never saw combat again. The Franklin disaster revealed what Japanese commanders already knew. Essex-Class carriers sacrificed passive protection for offensive capability. The unarmored hangar deck, which allowed more aircraft and faster operations, also allowed catastrophic damage when hit. But by March 1945, this trade-off mattered less than it might have earlier. American carriers operated with near impunity. Japanese air power had been so thoroughly destroyed that attacks like the one that crippled Franklin had become rare exceptions rather than constant threats. USS Bunker Hill, another Essex-Class carrier, suffered similarly devastating damage from 2 kamikaze strikes in May 1945. 390 crew died. The ship survived, limped home, never fought again. USS Intrepid endured 4 separate kamikaze attacks and kept fighting. The Essex-Class proved remarkably resilient even when Japanese attacks succeeded. None were sunk, Several were gutted. All but Franklin and Bunker Hill returned to service. The kamikaze campaign itself represented Japanese acknowledgement of what the Essex-Class and American carrier aviation had accomplished. Unable to defeat American carriers through conventional means, unable to produce aircraft and pilots capable of fighting on equal terms, Japan resorted to suicide attacks. The desperation was explicit. Junior officers and newly trained pilots, told they were precious assets of the empire, were instead being expended as guided missiles. The institutional knowledge required to train them properly no longer existed. Better to use them as weapons than waste months on training that couldn't replicate what experienced aviators knew. American carriers, particularly the Essex-Class, absorbed these attacks and continued operating. The sortie rate, the ability to launch and recover aircraft continuously, meant that even damaged carriers often kept flying aircraft until fires or casualties forced them to withdraw. USS Enterprise, the most veteran American carrier, was hit by a kamikaze on May 14, 1945. She was launching aircraft again within hours, conducting strikes against Kyushu the next day. The strategic impact of Essex-Class dominance extended far beyond individual battles. American control of the Philippine Sea following the June 1944 engagement opened the entire Western Pacific to invasion. The Marianas fell. Guam, Tinian, and Saipan became bases for B-29 superfortress bombers that could reach the Japanese home islands. The Philippines campaign followed, then Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, each invasion supported and protected by Essex-Class carriers and their air groups. Japanese commanders, in post-war interrogations, consistently identified American carrier supremacy as the decisive factor in Japan's defeat. Vice Admiral Taiho, who commanded surface forces at Leyte Gulf, stated, "Without carrier support, our surface fleet could not operate effectively. The American carrier force seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. We could not plan operations without assuming American carrier aircraft would attack. This limitation proved decisive. The Essex-Class made this omnipresence possible. By war's end, 17 Essex-Class carriers had been commissioned. 11 saw combat in World War II. They served in every major operation from late 1943 onward. They launched strikes against Tokyo itself. They supported every amphibious landing. They swept the Pacific of Japanese air power so thoroughly that by summer 1945, American carriers operated with near impunity within sight of the Japanese coast. The industrial accomplishment this represented staggered Japanese commanders who understood naval construction. Essex, the class lead ship, was laid down April 28, 1941. She commissioned December 31, 1942, 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. Franklin, built by Newport News Shipbuilding, required only 14 months. By comparison, the sole purpose-built Japanese fleet carrier commissioned during the war, Taiho, required 32 months from keel laying to commissioning. American shipyards delivered Essex-Class carriers faster than Japan could replace the pilots to fly from them. This disparity, more than any single battle, determined the Pacific War's outcome. Japan had begun the war with numerical carrier parity and superior pilots. By 1944, American carriers outnumbered Japanese carriers 3-1. American pilots had hundreds of hours more training. American aircraft were superior in every performance category. The Essex-Class embodied these advantages in steel and aviation gasoline. The human cost of this transformation rarely appeared in official histories, but shaped everything. American naval aviators who flew from Essex-Class carriers experienced the war differently than their counterparts on earlier carriers. The Essex-Class provided better ready rooms, air conditioning, more space, better facilities. These weren't luxuries. They were factors in combat effectiveness, pilots who could rest comfortably between missions, who could study mission plans in air-conditioned ready rooms, who weren't cramped into inadequate quarters, fought better. More significantly, the Essex-Class emphasis on sortie rate meant pilots flew more missions more frequently than on earlier carriers. This could be exhausting. It also meant more combat experience accumulated faster. By mid-1944, Typical American carrier pilots had dozens of combat missions. They had seen what worked and what failed. They had developed tactics through trial and error, and shared those lessons through formal training and informal mentorship. Japanese pilots in the same period often flew their first combat mission at Philippine Sea or later battles. They had no opportunity to learn from mistakes. The Americans killed them before that learning could occur. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, flying from USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft on June 19, 1944, bringing his total to 18 kills. He landed back aboard Lexington and immediately volunteered for the next mission. This was possible because the Essex-Class could maintain continuous operations. Vrasiu's experience level, multiplied across hundreds of American carrier pilots, created an expertise differential Japanese training programs couldn't overcome. The disparity extended to maintenance crews, air traffic controllers, radar operators, every specialty involved in carrier operations. American carriers maintained their aircraft better. They launched and recovered them more efficiently. They directed them more effectively. The Essex-Class provided the platform where this expertise could be fully utilized. The post-war assessment by American naval authorities concluded that the Essex-Class represented the most successful capital ship design of World War II, not because any individual ship accomplished unprecedented feats, but because the class, as a whole, delivered sustained combat power over years of operations across an ocean-spanning war. 24 Essex-Class carriers were ordered, 17 commissioned by 1950. None were lost to enemy action during World War II despite intensive combat operations. Several were heavily damaged. All but 2 returned to service. The design proved adaptable enough that modernized Essex-Class carriers served through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and into the Cold War. The last Essex-Class carrier, USS Lexington, didn't decommission until 1991, training naval aviators for nearly 5 decades. This longevity testified to the fundamental soundness of the design, but it also revealed something darker about the Battle of the Philippine Sea and its aftermath. The Essex-Class had been designed to win a specific kind of war: carrier versus carrier combat, massive strikes against enemy fleets, the projection of air power across vast distances. They did this brilliantly, but in winning that war so decisively, they made that kind of warfare obsolete. After the Philippine Sea, no enemy attempted carrier versus carrier combat against the United States. The disparity was too great. The Essex-Class had achieved what all truly revolutionary weapons achieve. They made themselves unnecessary by eliminating the threat they were designed to counter. Japanese commanders who survived the war, interviewed decades later, consistently returned to the same themes. They had underestimated American industrial capacity. They had failed to protect their experienced pilots. They had not understood how quickly technology and tactics were evolving. But above all, they had not imagined that carriers could operate at the tempo the Essex-Class maintained. Vice Admiral Ozawa, in his 1945 interrogation, was asked what single factor most contributed to Japanese defeat at Philippine Sea. His answer: American carrier operations achieved a speed and scale we considered impossible. We planned for them to launch perhaps 100 aircraft over the course of a morning. Instead, they launched hundreds continuously throughout the day. Our calculations were based on our own limitations. We assumed they faced the same limitations. This was our fundamental error. The Essex-Class had been designed precisely to break those limitations, to launch more aircraft faster, to maintain higher sortie rates longer, to operate continuously while enemy carriers operated episodically. In this, they succeeded completely. On the morning of June 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Ozawa had believed his longer-range aircraft and land-based support would dictate the terms of engagement. By evening, he understood that carrier warfare had fundamentally changed. The side that could generate the highest sortie rate with quality aircraft and pilots would win regardless of range or numbers. The Essex-Class, combined with Hellcats and experienced American aviators, represented a level of carrier capability Japan could neither match nor counter. 402 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day, 23 American aircraft lost in combat. The numbers tell the story. But behind the numbers lies the deeper truth. The Essex-class carriers hadn't simply won a battle. They had demonstrated that American naval aviation had achieved institutional superiority. Better training, better technology, better tactics, better logistics, better everything. And at the center of it all, 7 Essex-class carriers launching and recovering aircraft at rates Japanese commanders considered impossible, proving that the carrier war was over before it had truly begun. The ships designed to win it had done their job too well. The mathematics of carrier warfare had been rewritten. In the new equation, the Essex-class was the dominant variable. Everything else, Japanese courage, American determination, tactical innovation, strategic planning, mattered only within the framework those ships established. Launch more aircraft faster, maintain continuous operations, generate overwhelming combat power through sustained sortie rate. This was the lesson of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. This was the legacy of the Essex-class, not immortality in steel, but dominance so complete it ended the kind of warfare it was designed to fight. The carriers that could launch 100 aircraft in 30 minutes didn't need to. After June 19th, 1944, there was nothing left to fight. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.